The end of the 1940 Phoney War, a thunderclap prelude over Western Europe's plains. In April 1940, 7 months had passed since Germany's Blitzkrieg on Poland. The European continent was trapped in an eerie calm. Allied soldiers brewed coffee in the trenches along the Maginot Line, Danish fishermen still cast their nets in the North Sea, and the tinkle of reindeer bells echoed through Norway's mountain forests. This stalemate, later known as the Phoney War, led many to believe the conflict would gradually fizzle out in a standoff. But what they did not know was that in the underground command room of the Chancellery in Berlin, Hitler's finger was pressing firmly on a top-secret operational plan. Operation Weserübung and Case Yellow were already on the verge of execution. In the early hours of April 9, when the first German Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber sliced across the surface of the North Sea, and the first German tank rumbled over the wheat fields on Luxembourg's border, the fates of 5 Western European nations were irrevocably altered at that very moment. Over the next 46 days, the Blitzkrieg would show the world what the German war machine was truly capable of, in terms of speed. Dual strike over the North Sea, Denmark's 4-hour surrender and Norway's resistance in ice and snow. At 4 a.m. on April 9, 1940, the North Sea was shrouded in thick fog like a heavy white veil. Waves lapped against the hull of the German landing craft, emitting a dull, rumbling sound. The German Navy battleship Schleswig-Holstein had quietly approached the port of Copenhagen, Denmark. This old battleship, commissioned in 1906, had undergone 2 modifications, yet its main battery caliber remained at 280 mm, still powerful enough to pose a deterrent to the undefended Danish port. On the bridge, Captain Heinrich Kurt, Major Heinrich Kurt, held a pair of binoculars, gazing at the faint light from the Danish lighthouse in the distance. He whispered to his adjutant, "Send the signal at 5 o'clock sharp to order the landing troops into action." Meanwhile, in the mountain forests of Trondheim, Norway, the snow had piled up to 60 centimeters deep. 17-year-old high school student Olav Jensen carried a canvas schoolbag filled with textbooks, trudging through the snow in his snow boots, his steps heavy and uneven. The white mist from his breath froze instantly in the cold air. The only sound in his ears was the rustle of wind blowing through pine branches. Little did he know that a surprise attack that would change the fate of Northern Europe had already begun simultaneously in 2 countries. This was Operation Weserübung, Exercise Weser, a plan secretly approved by Hitler in February 1940, a dual blitzkrieg against Denmark and Norway. Its goal was to seize control of Northern Europe's iron ore resources and North Sea shipping lanes, clearing the flanks for the subsequent attack on Western Europe. The military force Germany deployed for this operation far exceeded the expectations of Northern European countries. 140,000 ground troops were organized into the Norwegian Army Group and the Danish Task Force. Of these, 100,000 troops were sent to Norway, equipped with 350 Panzer II light tanks, with armor thickness of 15 to 20 mm, only capable of withstanding rifle fire. A total of 132 naval vessels formed 3 battle groups, in addition to 10 destroyers and 8 U-boats. The battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were also assigned to cover the landing operations. For air support, 1,100 aircraft were assembled, 40% of which were Ju-87 dive bombers, specifically tasked with destroying enemy fortifications and airfields. Their schedule was precise to the minute: seize all strategic points in Denmark within 24 hours, and occupy Norway's capital Oslo and major ports within a week. For Denmark, however, the war was destined to be unbalanced from the start. This country, with a land area of only 43,000 square kilometers, had a borderline of 68 kilometers but only 14,000 troops in its national defense force. 60% of these soldiers were new recruits who had served for less than 6 months, and most were equipped with outdated 1898 model Mauser rifles. The entire army had only 6 75mm field guns, not a single dedicated anti-tank gun. 22-year-old Hans Christensen was a new recruit in the 3rd Danish Infantry Battalion, having enlisted just 3 months earlier. The outpost he guarded was located along the Holstebro border, 20 kilometers outside Copenhagen. On the wooden wall of the outpost hung a photo of him with his family. In the picture, his parents stood in front of their family's dairy farm, and his younger sister held a freshly picked apple in her hand. At 4:10 a.m., Hans was polishing his Mauser rifle with an old cloth, a bandage still wrapped around his arm, covering a wound from barbed wire during his first live-fire training, a medal from his military service. "When this Phoney War ends, I'll go home to help Dad fix the tractor," he had joked with his comrade Peter the night before. But at that moment, the distant rumble of tank tracks crushing the frozen ground made him grip the rifle stock tightly in an instant. He rushed to the observation post on top of the outpost. Through the frosty binoculars, he saw a sight he would never forget. At least 50 German Panzer II tanks advanced in a wedge formation through the morning fog, snow kicked up by their tracks swirling like white waves. The Iron Cross insignia on the tanks glinted coldly in the faint dawn light. Hans immediately pulled the alarm hanging on the wall, the sharp siren echoed across the silent border. The 12 soldiers in the outpost rushed out of the barracks and set up their rifles in the snow. But when the first tank shell landed 10 meters away from the outpost, snow splattered onto Hans' face. Only then did he realize, his rifle bullets, when hitting the tank's armor, left nothing but shallow dents, not even scratches. Germany's attack was all-encompassing. At the port of Copenhagen, the main battery of the Schleswig-Holstein opened fire first. Shells struck the port's defensive fortifications, sending fragments of bricks and snow flying in all directions. In the sky, 12 Ju-87 dive bombers roared past, their bombs under the wings accurately hitting the small Danish army airfield. 6 old biplane reconnaissance planes parked on the runway were instantly engulfed in flames. King Christian X of Denmark received the border battle report in the royal palace. The 67-year-old king, dressed in a dark blue military uniform, walked up to the map himself and traced the border line marked with red arrows. By then, German troops had broken through 3 border defense lines, the port of Copenhagen was blockaded by German warships, and the airfield in the northern city of Aalborg had also been seized by paratroopers. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of Prime Minister Thorvald Stauning, his voice trembling slightly, almost imperceptibly. "I just drove around half of Copenhagen. I saw citizens hiding in basements with their children, and shop windows shattered by shell fragments. Our soldiers have no anti-tank weapons, continuing to resist will only kill more innocent people." At 7:30 a.m., the Danish government held an emergency cabinet meeting and reached a consensus in just 30 minutes. At 8 o'clock sharp, the Prime Minister announced Denmark's surrender via national radio. From the start of Germany's attack to the surrender, only 4 hours had passed. In this short-lived war, the Danish army suffered 13 casualties, 3 of whom were killed, and 200 soldiers were captured, while Germany paid a price of only 8 wounded soldiers. Denmark thus became the sovereign country that surrendered the fastest during World War II. Hans Christensen and his comrades laid down their rifles in the snow in front of the outpost. German soldiers, wearing black leather boots, came over to confiscate their weapons. The sound of boot soles crunching through the snow was particularly harsh. Hans looked at the bandage on his arm and thought of his younger sister's words when he enlisted, "Come home safely." His eyes suddenly welled up with tears. Later, he wrote in his diary, "We are not cowards, we just had 2 weak weapons. I looked at the German soldiers on the tanks, there was no anger in their eyes, only numbness. Maybe they didn't want to fight either, but orders are orders. Surrender is not the end, it's to let more people survive until the day of liberation." After the surrender, King Christian X of Denmark refused Germany's offer to establish a puppet regime. He insisted on wearing his military uniform and riding a white horse to patrol the streets of Copenhagen every day, never taking off the medals on his chest. When a German soldier tried to force him to give the Nazi salute, he straightened his back and said, "I am the King of Denmark, I only salute my people." This act later became a symbol of Denmark's spirit of resistance and made German troops dare not easily offend the king. Meanwhile, the pace of the war in Norway was completely altered by its complex terrain. Lieutenant General Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, the German commander, a veteran who had fought in World War I, had carefully studied Norway's fjord terrain and tidal patterns when formulating the Norwegian phase of Operation Weserübung. He knew that the fjords on Norway's west coast were deep and narrow, allowing large warships to pass only during specific tidal periods. Moreover, the terrain, 70% covered by mountains and forests, would make it difficult for tank units to deploy. Therefore, he developed the tactic of airborne capture of key hubs plus naval landing at multiple points. First, use paratroopers to seize airports and ports in cities such as Oslo, Trondheim, and Bergen, cutting off the Norwegian army supply lines. Then, deploy ground troops to land from 5 locations along the fjords and gradually advance inland. To simulate Norway's combat environment, German paratroopers had conducted special training in the Bavarian Alps of Germany before the war, practicing glider landings, climbing, and tactical coordination in snowy and mountainous terrain. At 2 p.m. on April 9, 120 German paratroopers boarded 11 DFS-230 gliders and landed precisely on both sides of the runway at Oslo's Fornebu airport. At that time, the Norwegian airport was guarded by only 30 soldiers, equipped with old machine guns. They were forced to retreat after resisting for just 20 minutes. However, King Haakon VII of Norway refused Germany's demand for surrender. The 59-year-old king, 1 hour before German troops occupied Oslo, took government officials and fled to Trondheim by special train. On the train, he delivered a speech to the entire country via national radio. Norway is a free nation, we will never become a vassal of Germany. Even if the capital falls, we will continue to resist in the mountains and fjords until we drive the invaders out of our land. 17-year-old Olav Jensen was listening to this broadcast in his school auditorium. When he heard the king say, "Every Norwegian can be a resistor," he stood up suddenly, and his classmates Eric and Ingrid nodded in agreement beside him. Olav's father was an engineer at a local machinery factory who had taught him basic mechanical principles and explosive knowledge. That night, Olav and his classmates sneaked into his father's factory, carried 5 kilograms of explosives and 10 detonators from the warehouse, wrapped them in canvas, and hid them in the mountains. In the late night of May 15, on a German supply road on the outskirts of Trondheim, Norway, the snow reflected the moonlight. Olav and 3 of his classmates lay in the snow, covered with white sheets for camouflage. They had been lying in ambush for 3 hours, their fingers were so cold that they could barely hold their axes. "Listen, a vehicle is coming," Eric whispered. The sound of a truck engine could be heard in the distance. Following the method his father had taught him, Olav tied the explosives to a tree trunk beside the road and connected the fuse to a snow pit 10 meters away. When a German truck, carrying ammunition and food, drove past the tree trunk, Olav pulled the fuse sharply. With a loud boom, the truck's front wheels were blown off, and the vehicle flipped into the snow ditch by the side of the road. German soldiers climbed out of the cab, holding guns and looking around. Olav and his classmates hurried to flee into the mountains, but Eric's snow boot got stuck in the roots of a tree. He was shot in the left leg by a German soldier. Just then, 3 Norwegian guerrillas rushed out of the woods, suppressed the German fire with submachine guns, and dragged Eric into the deep mountains. The guerrilla leader, Olav Peterson, patted Olav on the shoulder and said, "You kids are braver than we thought. But next time you go on a mission, you need to learn how to hide your footprints first." Norway's resistance received substantial support from the Allied forces. On April 14, 1940, a total of 30,000 Allied expeditionary troops, consisting of the British 24th Guards Brigade and the 13th Demi Brigade of the French Foreign Legion, boarded 28 transport ships. Under the cover of the British Royal Navy battlecruiser HMS Renown, they landed at Narvik port in northern Norway. Most of these soldiers had fought in World War I and were familiar with positional warfare tactics. They used the narrow terrain of the Narvik fjords to dig trenches on the hillsides and ambushed German Panzer II tanks with anti-tank rifles. On April 20, British soldier Thomas Wilson used a Boy's anti-tank rifle to penetrate the side armor of a German tank at a distance of 150 meters. The fuel inside the tank leaked and caught fire, marking the Allies' first tank kill record on the Norwegian battlefield. However, this good fortune did not last long. On May 10, Germany launched Case Yellow, Fall Gelb, to attack Western Europe, and France's homeland was in urgent danger. The Allies had no choice but to withdraw their troops from Norway. On June 2, the last batch of Allied soldiers boarded transport ships. As they watched the Norwegian coastline gradually fade away, Wilson wrote in his diary, "We are not retreating, we are just leaving temporarily. One day, we will come back." Germany's advance on the Norwegian battlefield was far more difficult than anticipated. Falkenhorst had originally planned to occupy Norway within a week, but due to guerrilla harassment and harsh weather, the operation took a full 2 months. Of Germany's 5,700 casualties, nearly 2,000 were non-combat losses caused by frostbite and snow blindness. Nighttime temperatures in northern Norway could drop to -25 degrees Celsius, the cotton pants of German soldiers could not withstand the severe cold, and many soldiers had their toes frozen off. On June 10, the Norwegian government in exile announced in London, UK, that it would temporarily halt organized resistance, but civilian resistance never stopped. Fishermen used their boats to secretly transport resistors and intelligence. Teachers secretly taught Norwegian history in classrooms, refusing to use German textbooks. Even the Norwegian royal family's pet dog once pounced and bit a German officer when he approached the king. In a report to Berlin, Falkenhorst wrote, "Norwegians are like snow foxes in the mountains, they know every inch of this land. Even if we occupy the cities, we can never control the entire country." On June 10, 1940, as German troops held an occupation ceremony, in Oslo's City Hall Square, Olav Jensen was hiding in a guerrilla camp in the mountains, changing the dressing on Eric's wound. By the campfire, guerrillas passed around a newspaper brought from the UK, which printed news of the Allied evacuation from Dunkirk. "The Allies have left, but we still have each other," Olav said, clutching the hunting rifle in his hand. The stock was carved with his father's name. In the streets of Copenhagen, Hans Christensen watched German soldiers parade with Nazi flags. He quietly took out a small Danish flag from his arms, a flag he had hidden inside his military uniform when he surrendered. The edges of the flag were already soaked with sweat, yet it remained bright. He tucked the flag into his collar, feeling the fabric press against his chest, and whispered to himself, "When spring comes and the snow melts, we will be able to go home." This Operation Weserübung allowed Germany to control 180 million tons of iron ore resources in northern Europe, accounting for 40% of Germany's iron ore consumption during the war, and 2,000 kilometers of North Sea coastline. However, it also made Hitler realize that the Blitzkrieg was not invincible. In the face of complex terrain and tenacious resistance, even with superior equipment, a heavy price had to be paid. The resistance of Denmark and Norway was like 2 seeds buried in the snow. Over the next 5 years, they took root and sprouted slowly, and finally, when the Allies liberated Europe in 1945, they bloomed into flowers of freedom. Blitzkrieg over the Low Countries, Luxembourg's silent fall, and the Netherlands' airborne nightmare. At 3 a.m. on May 10, 1940, the streets of Luxembourg City, the capital of Luxembourg, were still wrapped in deep slumber. A thin layer of ice covered the bronze fountain in the old town square, and the hands of the clock tower on the city hall slowly glided past the mark for 3. 35-year-old Mayor Jean Dupont had just finished his night patrol. As the administrator of this neutral country's capital, he had inspected the city's defenses nearly every dawn for the past 6 months, even though Luxembourg's army had only 2,000 soldiers, most of whom were part-time farmers and craftsmen, armed with outdated rifles purchased from Belgium in 1920. Dupont pulled his woolen coat tightly around him and stared at the sandbags piled at the street corner, a faint sense of unease stirring in his chest. 3 days earlier, Belgium's ambassador to Luxembourg had quietly told him about unusual tank movements along Germany's border, but Allied intelligence had dismissed it as just a routine German military exercise. That unease turned into reality an hour later. At 4:05 a.m., along the banks of the Alzette River on Luxembourg's eastern border, the vanguard of Germany's 1st Panzer Division, a strike group of 50 Panzer III tanks, rumbled over the boundary marker labeled Neutral Zone. These tanks had 30 mm thick frontal armor and were equipped with 50 mm main guns, capable of penetrating most anti-tank guns of the Dutch and Belgian armies at a distance of 800 meters. By contrast, Luxembourg's army had no heavier weapons than 6 75mm field guns, and not a single armor-piercing round for them. Germany's advance met no resistance. At the border outpost, 3 Luxembourg soldiers watched the tank column approach, too slow to sound the alarm before being detained by German troops. For the bridges over the Alzette River, the defending soldiers had planned to blow them up, but German paratroopers had landed nearby in advance, using submachine guns to suppress the Guards' machine gun positions. Luxembourg's resistance lasted a mere 2 hours. At 6 a.m., tanks of the 1st Panzer Division rolled into Luxembourg City. The sound of their tracks crushing the cobblestones woke the citizens. Dupont stood in front of the city hall, facing a demand from German commander Colonel Hans von Luckner: hoist the Nazi flag and declare acceptance of Germany's protection. Calmly, Dupont refused. Luxembourg is a neutral country. We will not bow to any invader. But to avoid civilian casualties, we will not offer armed resistance. When Colonel Luckner threatened to shell the city hall, Dupont turned and walked into the building. He told his secretary to take down the Luxembourg flag and keep it safe, then sat in his office, waiting for the German troops to arrest him. That morning, Luxembourg's government announced via national radio the cessation of all defensive operations. This country, with an area of just 2,586 square kilometers, became the first Low Country to fall to Germany's Case Yellow, Fall Gelb, offensive. Not a single life was lost in the process, yet it forever lost its wartime neutrality. Dupont was placed under house arrest in an apartment next to the city hall, with German soldiers standing guard at the door to cut off his contact with the outside world. But he had secretly hidden a small radio, and every night he listened to BBC broadcasts from Britain, recording news of the Allied war effort in a notebook. One day in June, he noticed someone had written "Luxembourg will be free" on the wall outside his apartment window in chalk. Later, he learned it was 14-year-old Jean-Marie, who snuck out to write it every time the German guards changed shifts. Dupont later wrote in his memoirs, "Occupation can take away land, but it cannot extinguish the flame of resistance in people's hearts." Even a single sentence in chalk is a testament to faith in freedom. Meanwhile, on the Dutch battlefield, World War II's first large-scale airborne operation was unfolding. To break through the Netherlands' Dutch fortress defense system, a line of defense using the Maas and Waal rivers as natural barriers, equipped with 10 infantry divisions, 120 47mm anti-tank guns, and 300 machine gun bunkers, Germany deployed 16,000 paratroopers, organized into the 7th Parachute Division, Fallschirmjägerdivision, and the 22nd Air Landing Division, Luftland Division, under the command of Lieutenant General Kurt Student. Student was the founder of Germany's airborne tactics. Drawing on experience from the Norwegian campaign, he developed the 3-point airborne plan: parachute into The Hague to seize control of the Dutch royal family and government, land in Rotterdam to capture the Maas River bridges, and deploy troops at Schiphol Airport to prevent the Dutch Air Force from taking off. 28-year-old Dutch paratrooper Jan van der Sar, serving in the 1st Parachute Regiment of the Royal Dutch Army, was stationed in a defensive bunker on the south bank of the Maas River in Rotterdam. At 3:30 a.m. on May 10, he was woken by a low hum from the sky. It was German DFS 230 gliders, dragging long shadows as they flew toward the Maas River bridges. Enemy paratroopers. Van der Sar grabbed his Mannlicher M1895 rifle and rushed to the firing port at the top of the bunker. He watched as dozens of gliders landed precisely on both sides of the bridge. German paratroopers jumped out of the cabins, firing MP-40 submachine guns at the Dutch defenders. Van der Sar pulled the trigger, taking down a German soldier who was setting up a machine gun, but more paratroopers swarmed in, and the bunker on the north bank of the bridge was soon captured. The Dutch army's resistance was far more tenacious than the Germans had anticipated. Fighting at Schiphol Airport lasted 4 hours. Soldiers from the 2nd Dutch Infantry Division used the farmland and woods around the airport to wage street battles against the German paratroopers. 22-year-old Dutch soldier Hendrik Jansen used an anti-tank rifle to pierce the armor of a German half-track at a distance of 50 meters. The vehicle's fuel tank leaked and caught fire, triggering an explosion in its ammunition supply that killed 8 German soldiers. But German air support arrived sooner. Ju-87 dive bombers roared in, launching repeated bombing runs on the Dutch positions. Most of Hendrik's comrades were killed, and he himself was hit by shrapnel in his left leg, forcing him to retreat to a warehouse near the airport. The battle for Rotterdam became the turning point of the entire Dutch campaign. On May 14, Germany's 9th Panzer Division closed in on downtown Rotterdam, demanding the Dutch defenders surrender within 1 hour, or the city would be bombed. Dutch Commander-in-Chief General Henri Winkelman was caught in a dilemma. Downtown Rotterdam was home to 300,000 civilians, and the Dutch still held the Maas River bridges, but German tanks had broken through the outer defenses, and ammunition reserves would last only 2 more hours. Winkelman stood in his command post, watching the spire of a church hit by artillery fire outside the window, and said to his staff, "We could resist, but civilians must not be made to pay the price." He decided to send envoys to negotiate with the Germans, yet unbeknownst to him, German He-111 bombers had already taken off, dropping 97 tons of bombs on downtown Rotterdam during the negotiations. Van der Sar was hiding in an apartment in Rotterdam's Old Town at the time. When the bombs fell, the entire building shook violently, and shards of window glass flew like knives. He held a terrified little girl in his arms, huddling in the corner of the stairwell, listening to the screams and explosions outside. When the bombing stopped, he stepped out of the apartment to find a wasteland. The once bustling commercial streets had been burned to ashes, charred wood and bodies floated on the Maas River, 814 civilians were killed in the bombing, and 24,000 buildings were destroyed. "I will never forget the look in that little girl's eyes," Van der Sar later said in an interview. "She asked me, 'Where are my mom and dad?' And I had no answer for her." On the morning of May 15, General Winkelman announced the Netherlands' surrender via national radio. By then, the Dutch army had suffered 23,000 casualties, and German paratroopers had 3,500 casualties, with the 7th Parachute Division losing nearly 40% of its strength, yet Germany had seized control of 90% of Dutch territory. Before surrendering, Winkelman told his troops, "We have lost the battle, but we have not lost our dignity. Remember today's sacrifice, for it is for tomorrow's freedom." Van der Sar and his surviving comrades laid down their weapons. German soldiers confiscated their rifles, but allowed them to keep their personal daggers. Van der Sar's dagger had belonged to his father, with the words, "Hold fast to your faith," carved into its sheath. After the Netherlands surrender, Lieutenant General Studen inspected the battlefield in Rotterdam. Seeing the destroyed city, he said to his staff, "This is not the victory I wanted. The purpose of airborne warfare is to reduce casualties, not to destroy cities." Later, due to his opposition to Hitler's scorched earth policy, he was temporarily dismissed from his post in 1944. General Winkelman was placed under house arrest by the Germans in a castle in central Netherlands, and was not released until the Allies liberated the Netherlands in 1945. When he returned to Rotterdam, he saw citizens holding up signs that read, "Welcome home," and tears rolled down his cheeks. "I have not failed the weight of all of you," he said. This blitzkrieg against the Low Countries allowed Germany to take control of Luxembourg and the Netherlands in just 5 days, opening a western corridor for its subsequent attacks on Belgium and France. Yet it also exposed flaws in Germany's airborne tactics. Paratroopers lacked heavy weapons, and once they encountered tenacious resistance, they fell into passivity. The fall of Luxembourg and the Netherlands also made the Allies realize the fragility of static defense. Even with natural barriers and bunkers, they could not stop Germany's combined tactic of airborne assault plus armoured advance. In June 1940, German troops held a victory parade in Rotterdam. Van der Sar stood in the crowd, watching German tanks roll across the Maas River Bridge, secretly tucking his father's dagger into his sleeve. He noticed a small Dutch flag painted in red paint on the wall of a street corner. It was his comrade Hendrik, who, despite his disabled left leg, was still secretly organizing a resistance group. Van der Sar walked over and patted Hendrik on the shoulder. The two said nothing, but exchanged a look, a silent understanding between resistors, and a symbol of the unextinguished hope of the Low Countries. Fortress Miracle, the fingertip raid on Belgium's Fort Ebony Mail. At 4:30 a.m. on May 10, 1940, the Ardennes mountains in eastern Belgium were still shrouded in pitch-black night. The searchlights of Fort Ébène swept across the snow, leaving streaks of pale white light. 45-year-old Belgian Army Major Jacques de Vlaming stood on the central command tower of the fortress, holding a cup of hot coffee. The white mist from his breath dissipated instantly in the frigid air. As the commander of this fortress, dubbed by the Allies as the strongest fortress in Europe, he had been stationed here for 5 years, knowing every gun emplacement and every passage like the back of his hand. The fortress stretched 8 kilometers long, with 80-centimeter thick reinforced concrete walls embedded 1.5 meters underground, capable of withstanding direct hits from 122mm howitzers. 12 120mm howitzers were deployed in a fan shape, covering a 20-kilometer radius around the fortress. 8 75mm cannons were specialized for armored targets, 34 Maxim heavy machine guns formed an interlocking fire network, and the 1,200 defenders, all elites from the Belgian 7th Infantry Division, were equipped with the most advanced 47mm anti-tank guns of the time. Even if the Germans send 100,000 men, they'll have to pile their corpses in front of the fortress, Vlaming had joked with his men the night before. Little did he know that death was quietly approaching from the night sky, aboard gliders. At that moment, 11 German DFS-230 gliders were flying low, skimming the treetops of the Ardennes mountains. Inside the cabins, 85 German commandos, belonging to the Coke Commando unit, gripped their MP-40 submachine guns, with explosive packs clipped to their waists and their faces smudged with black ash. 26-year-old commando leader Lieutenant Walter Koch, who had participated in the annexation of Austria in 1938 and was a backbone of German special operations, had received only one order for this mission: seize control of the fortress roof within 10 minutes, and disable all artillery within 2 hours. The DFS-230 glider was a model specially designed by Germany for raids. Unpowered, it could be towed by Ju-52 transport aircraft to the airspace above the target and then released. Its fuselage was coated with sound-absorbing material to minimize flight noise, which explained why Belgium's only 2 early warning radars had detected only the signals of the towing aircraft, while ignoring these silent killers. At 4:35 a.m., the glider formation detached from the towing aircraft 500 meters above the fortress roof, drifting toward the target like sheets of paper. The No. 1 glider carrying Lieutenant Koch landed precisely in a gun-blind spot on the northeastern side of the fortress, a 200-square-meter area that was the only flaw in the fortress's design. Its roof armor was only 15 centimeters thick, and no anti-aircraft weapons were installed here. Plans to add anti-aircraft machine guns had been shelved due to budget shortages. The impact of the glider's landing sent Koch crashing into the cabin wall. He rubbed his sore ribs and immediately shouted, "Move out." 8 commandos jumped out of the cabin quickly, attaching specially made hollow charge explosives, filled with 1.5 kilograms of TNT, capable of penetrating concrete, to the muzzles of the howitzers on the fortress roof. Boom! The first explosion rang out in the early morning silence, blowing a large hole in the muzzle of the fortress's 120mm howitzer. The high-temperature blast waved through the Belgian gunners inside out. Hearing the explosion, Vlaming dropped his coffee cup in shock. "Where is that explosion coming from?" A communications soldier replied in a panic, "The roof. The Germans are on the roof." Vlaming rushed to the observation port and looked through his binoculars. What he saw made his hair stand on end. Dozens of German soldiers were running across the fortress roof, and the sound of explosive packs detonating echoed one after another. The once imposing howitzers were now nothing but smoking wrecks. He immediately gave the order, "Send the reserve force up through the internal passages and drive them out." But the Germans acted faster. Lieutenant Koch divided his 85 men into 5 squads, each assigned to attack one of the fortress's 5 artillery groups. 22-year-old Commando Heinz Schneider was hit in the right arm by machine gun fire from Belgian defenders while attacking the southwestern 75mm cannon emplacement. Blood instantly soaked his uniform. Gritting his teeth, he used his left hand to stuff an explosive pack into the gap of the cannon, pulled the fuse, and rolled aside. the explosion destroyed the cannon's breech and temporarily deafened him. "Leave me alone, keep moving forward," Schneider shouted to his teammates, even though he could barely hear his own voice. By 4:45 a.m., in just 10 minutes, the Germans had destroyed 10 of the fortress's artillery pieces and seized control of 90% of the roof area. Meanwhile, the Belgian reserve force was still stuck in the crowded internal passages. These passages were designed to be narrow, allowing only 2 people to walk side by side, a fatal obstacle to the defenders' reinforcement efforts. The fighting inside the fortress was equally brutal. 24-year-old Belgian Corporal Jean Leclerc, a member of the fortress reserve force, advanced through the passages with his comrades, rifle in hand, staying alert for German ambushes at every step. "Germans up ahead!" A comrade had just shouted when he was hit in the chest by MP-40 fire. Leclerc took cover behind a passage corner, threw a hand grenade, and after the explosion, rushed forward to find 3 German soldiers lying on the ground, one still clutching an undetonated explosive pack. "They weren't many, but they were ruthless," Leclerc later recalled. "It was like they knew the location of every passage, we couldn't defend against them at all." By 6 a.m., the Germans had fully taken control of the fortress roof and began using explosives to blow open the internal entrances of the fortress. Flamink looked at the battle report handed to him by the communications soldier. All artillery on the roof had been destroyed, 300 reserve troops had been killed or wounded, German forces were continuing to infiltrate the interior, and the German 6th Panzer Division outside had already broken through Belgium's forward defense lines and was advancing toward the fortress. "How much ammunition do we have left?" Flamink asked. "Only 20 rounds left for the anti-tank guns, and we're almost out of machine gun bullets," the communications soldier replied, his voice trembling. Flamink leaned against the wall of the command tower, recalling his promise to the king 5 years earlier when he first took command. "Fort Ébène will be Belgium's iron barrier." Yet now, this barrier had been breached in just 1 hour and 45 minutes. At 6:15 a.m., Flamink announced via the fortress's broadcast system, "To avoid more meaningless sacrifices, we will cease resistance." When Lieutenant Koch walked into the command tower and saw Flamink neatly folding the Belgian flag, he stepped forward and said, "You are a brave opponent." Flamink looked up, his eyes filled with unwillingness. "I didn't lose because my soldiers lacked courage, I lost because of tactics. I never imagined anyone would attack this fortress from the roof." In this raid, the Germans captured the strongest fortress in Europe with only 6 casualties, 3 dead, 3 wounded, while the Belgian defenders suffered 210 casualties and 990 were captured. The fall of Fort Ébène triggered a chain reaction across the entire Western European battlefield. As the core of Belgium's DIL line defense system, its loss created a huge gap in the line, allowing the German 6th Panzer Division to advance unimpeded, reaching Leuven in central Belgium in just 3 days. In his Paris headquarters, Allied Supreme Commander General Maurice Gamelin stared at the red arrows on the map, which were advancing steadily southward, and said helplessly, "The fall of Fort Ébène has thrown our entire defense plan into chaos." The Allied First Army, originally stationed in northern France, was forced to rush north to reinforce Belgium, unaware that this played right into the Germans' hands. The core of Hitler's Case Yellow, Fall Gelb, was to use a feigned attack on Belgium, to draw the main Allied forces north, then send armoured units to outflank through the Ardennes mountains and cut off the Allies' retreat. After his capture, Flamink was detained in a German prisoner-of-war camp and not liberated by the Allies until 1945. In 1946, he stood trial at a Belgian military court. Faced with accusations of negligence of duty, he held up the fortress's design plans and said, "The defense concept at that time only considered ground attacks, no one could have imagined that paratroopers would become the fortress's nemesis." This defeat was inevitable for the era, not a personal failure. The court ultimately acquitted him. Later, he participated in Belgium's post-war national defense construction, proposing the concept of three-dimensional defense and emphasizing the importance of anti-aircraft defense. Lieutenant Koch, meanwhile, was personally awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross by Hitler for his merits in the Ébène operation, but his fate was tragic. In 1941, while commanding special forces in a raid on Leningrad on the Eastern Front, he was killed by a Soviet Red Army sniper at the age of 28. In his diary, there was a passage, "The victory at Ardennes wasn't because we were strong, it was because the enemy underestimated innovative tactics." The essence of war has always been to break with convention. On May 17, 1940, German tanks rumbled past the ruins of Fort Ardennes, advancing toward the French border. On the concrete debris of the fortress roof, the traces of explosive blasts from that day were still visible, the barrels of the 120mm howitzers tilted crookedly toward the sky, like silent tombstones. In the underground passages of the fortress, the corner where Belgian soldier Jean Leclerc had escaped the massacre later became known to tourists as the Corner of Courage. A plaque hanging on the wall reads, "On May 10, 1940, this place witnessed the innovation of tactics and the dignity of resistance." The raid on Fort Ardennes became one of the most classic special operations cases of defeating the strong with the weak in World War II. It proved the fragility of static defense and promoted the development of modern airborne tactics and special operations. To this day, military academies around the world still study this battle, exploring how to destroy the strongest fortresses at the lowest cost, and how to break free from conventional thinking to attack where the enemy least expects it. For the Belgians, the fall of Fort Ardennes is not only a humiliating chapter in history but also a wake-up call, reminding the country that peace requires a strong national defense, and more importantly, a defense concept that keeps pace with the times. Rout and Retreat, The Allies, Low Countries Trap, and the Prelude to Dunkirk. In the early morning of May 15, 1940, on the Waterloo Plains outside Brussels, Belgium, 20-year-old British soldier Tom Wilson huddled in a trench, gnawing on a hard piece of bread. The bread had been distributed 3 days earlier, its edges rock-hard, and he had to wash it down with melted snow to swallow. Sporadic gunfire echoed in the distance. His unit, the 3rd British Infantry Division, was stationed alongside the 1st French Army on the Dill Line in western Belgium. This defense line, which Allied commanders had placed great hope in, was built along the Dill River, equipped with 200 anti-tank guns and 50 French Renault FT-17 tanks. Yet no one realized that the German sickle-cut plan had already torn a fatal gap in their flank. Just as Tom finished his bread, in the Ardennes forest in southern Belgium, General Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps was advancing at a speed of 60 km per day. This strike force, composed of 3 panzer divisions and 2 motorized infantry divisions, was equipped with 400 Panzer III and IV tanks, easily breaking through the Ardennes, an area the French had deemed impassable for armoured units. On May 17, German troops captured Sedan, France. On May 20, their vanguard reached Abbeville on the English Channel coast, completely cutting off the connection between the Allied forces in Belgium and mainland France. 300,000 Allied soldiers, 95,000 British, 180,000 French, and 25,000 Belgian, were suddenly trapped in a German pocket, confined to a narrow strip of land from western Belgium to Dunkirk, France, an area of less than 500 square kilometers. Tom first felt the terror of encirclement on May 22. That morning, his company received orders to retreat to Leuven, northeast of Brussels, to cover the Belgian army's flank. But shortly after setting off, they came under attack by German dive bombers. 3 Ju-87 Stuka bombers screamed down from the sky, their sirens wailing. Bombs landed in the middle of the column. Tom's comrade Peter was blown over on the spot, and the letters from home in his backpack scattered across the snow, still bearing the small house drawn by Peter's younger sister. "Don't stop. Keep running," the company commander shouted. Tom couldn't help but look back and saw Peter's hand twitching weakly. He rushed back to pull Peter up, but the commander grabbed him tightly. "If we stay any longer, we'll all die here." In London at that time, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was chairing an emergency war cabinet meeting. A map of the Western European battlefield hung on the meeting room wall. Red arrows stretched from the Ardennes forest all the way to the English Channel, while the blue-marked Allied positions had been compressed into a tiny triangle. Secretary of State for War Anthony Eden wiped sweat from his forehead and said, "The British troops in Belgium have been without food for 2 days, their ammunition is only enough for 3 defensive battles. The French supply lines have also been cut off, and King Leopold III of Belgium has hinted at a possible surrender. Churchill smoked a cigar in silence, his finger tapping gently on the port of Dunkirk on the map. This small port in northern France had now become the Allies' only escape route, and the English Channel beyond it had turned into a life-or-death line for 300,000 men. On May 25, King Leopold III of Belgium announced his surrender. This became the final straw that broke the Allied defense line. The Belgian surrender left the Allies' left flank completely exposed, and the German Sixth Army took the opportunity to advance from the north, forming a pincer with Guderian's armoured corps in the south. That afternoon, Thom's company encountered the German 7th Panzer Division outside Leuven. Leading the charge were German Panzer IV tanks, their 75mm main guns firing shells like raindrops into the Allied trenches. Thom's rifle was useless against the tanks, he and his comrades could only attack the tank tracks with hand grenades. For every tank destroyed, at least 5 soldiers paid with their lives. "We were like lambs to the slaughter," Thom later recalled. The roar of tanks, the screams of soldiers, the blast of bombs, all mixed together. "I couldn't even tell which direction to run, so I just followed the crowd backward." The French resistance during this rout was equally fierce. 25-year-old French soldier Pierre Leclerc, serving in the 5th French Infantry Division, was stationed in Charleroi, Belgium. On May 26, his position was breached by German troops, and the unit was split into small groups, forced to fight as guerrillas in the woods. Pierre's left leg was hit by shrapnel. He dragged his injured leg and led 3 wounded soldiers to hide in an abandoned farmhouse. The farm's owners, an elderly couple, gave the soldiers bread and milk and helped Pierre dress his wound. "Will you win?" the old woman asked. Pierre looked at the German patrols outside the window and said firmly, "We will come back. We promise." But the next morning, German troops discovered the farmhouse. To protect the soldiers, the elderly couple lied and said they were their sons, but the Germans saw through the lie. The couple was shot on the spot, and Pierre and the wounded soldiers took the chance to flee into the woods, finally catching up with the retreating main force on May 28. The Allies' retreat was filled with chaos and sacrifice. The roads from western Belgium to Dunkirk were packed with retreating soldiers, fleeing civilians, and destroyed vehicles. German aircraft bombed continuously. In the fields beside the roads, burned-out trucks and dead soldiers lay everywhere. 23-year-old British nurse Emily Davis worked in a field hospital located in a school outside Dunkirk. On May 27, as German troops closed in on the hospital, Emily and her colleagues had to evacuate the wounded, carrying the severely injured on stretchers, while the lightly wounded supported each other, advancing with great difficulty amid the air raids. One wounded soldier had lost his leg, but he insisted on taking his prosthetic with him, Emily said. He said, "This is my medal from the battlefield. We walked all night and only reached Dunkirk harbor at dawn. Many wounded died from blood loss along the way. I could only write down their names in a notebook, hoping to tell their families someday." On May 26, Britain launched Operation Dynamo, the Dunkirk evacuation. Britain mobilized every available vessel, from Royal Navy destroyers and cruisers to civilian fishing boats, yachts, ferries, and even private dinghies. In total, 861 ships participated in the evacuation. That afternoon, the first batch of British soldiers boarded the destroyers. Thom and Pierre were among them. As the ship pulled away from Dunkirk harbor, Thom stood on the deck and looked back at the burning city, tears streaming down his face. He thought of Peter's scattered letters, of the comrades who had died during the retreat, and of the eyes of the elderly Belgian couple. "We are not cowards," he said to Pierre beside him. "We are staying alive so we can come back someday and avenge them." This rout cost the Allies dearly. The British suffered 18,000 casualties, including 6,000 dead, lost 240 tanks and 1,200 artillery pieces. The French had 42,000 casualties, 12,000 dead, and 15,000 captured. The Belgian army suffered 23,000 casualties and was almost completely wiped out. The Germans, by contrast, had 35,000 casualties, lost 100 tanks and 150 aircraft, but successfully seized control of northern Western Europe, paving the way for their subsequent attack on mainland France. On May 28, Churchill delivered a speech in the British House of Commons: "The Dunkirk evacuation is not the end, but the beginning. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." At that time, large numbers of soldiers were still waiting to be evacuated from Dunkirk harbor, and German air raids continued. Yet the fear that had once filled the soldiers' eyes was gone, replaced by a firm resolve. They knew this retreat was not a defeat, but a way to preserve their fighting strength for the counteroffensive to come. Tom Wilson later participated in the D-Day landings. On June 6, 1944, he set foot on French soil again, this time as an attacker. Pierre Leclerc joined de Gaulle's Free French forces and helped liberate Paris. Emily Davis continued working in field hospitals until the end of the war. None of them forgot the rout of May 1940, nor the comrades who had sacrificed their lives. For they knew that it was that difficult retreat that sowed the seeds of victory for the future. The shadow of occupation and the spark of resistance, the turning point and continuation of the Western European campaign. In the evening of May 28, 1940, a light drizzle fell over the Grand Place in Brussels, Belgium. The Nazi swastika flag fluttered atop the spire of the City Hall, creating a jarring contrast with the elegant Gothic reliefs adorning the squares surrounding buildings. A few German soldiers stood in the square, taking photos with their cameras, their leather boots crunched over the damp cobblestones, occasionally kicking at discarded newspapers left by civilians. The ink of the front-page headline, "Belgium Surrenders," had blurred in the rain. On this day, as King Leopold III of Belgium signed the instrument of surrender, Germany gained complete control over 5 Western European countries, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, within a mere 46 days. Covering a total area of 740,000 square kilometers and home to approximately 16 million people, the northwestern corner of continental Western Europe was fully shrouded in the shadow of Nazi occupation. Behind this Blitzkrieg victory, however, lay a 5-year-long silent standoff between the occupiers and the occupied. Germany's cost of victory was far lower than expected. Throughout the campaigns in the Low Countries and Northern Europe, the German military suffered 67,000 casualties, including 11,000 deaths, lost 217 tanks and 320 aircraft. By contrast, the Allies endured 18,000 British casualties, 42,000 French casualties, 23,000 Belgian casualties, and 23,000 Dutch casualties. The loss of weapons and equipment among the 5 occupied countries was even more staggering. The Netherlands alone had 400 artillery pieces and 120 armoured vehicles captured by German forces, while the 12 120mm howitzers from Belgium's Fort Eben-Emael were repurposed by the Germans for the Atlantic Wall. At a victory banquet in the Berlin Chancellery, Hitler boasted to his generals, "The bones of Western Europe are softer than we imagined, Blitzkrieg will make the entire continent submit." Yet he deliberately ignored the soaring costs of occupation. Germany had to deploy 250,000 troops to garrison the 5 countries, including 6 divisions stationed in Norway alone, consuming 80,000 tons of grain and 12,000 tons of ammunition monthly. These supplies had to be transported from mainland Germany by rail and sea. The transportation of iron ore from Narvik, Norway, alone occupied 30% of Germany's naval transport vessels, directly leading to a 40% shortage of logistical ships during the preliminary preparations for Germany's Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union in the second half of 1940. The shadow of occupation first fell over the daily lives of ordinary civilians. Denmark, designated as Germany's model occupied territory, retained its royal family and government in name, but actual control rested with the German Defense Commissioner. German authorities mandated that Danish farms hand over 40% of their grain and 60% of their dairy products to supply German troops in Western Europe. Urban residents faced bread rationing, with adults receiving only 2.5 kilograms of black bread per month. Commodities like butter and sugar were even scarcer. 22-year-old Danish soldier Hans Christensen had returned to his family's dairy farm on Zealand. He watched as German soldiers loaded freshly milked milk onto military trucks emblazoned with Wehrmacht Versorgung, Wehrmacht supply, his fists clenched tightly. His mother, who had diabetes, relied on milk to stabilize her blood sugar, and the German rations were far from sufficient. But Hans did not remain silent. At night, he would fill ceramic jars with milk, hide them in the potato pile in the farm's cellar, and pass them to the underground resistance through his neighbors. In 1943, when Denmark launched its large-scale rescue of Jews, Hans used this cellar hiding method to help 3 Jewish families evade German searches, eventually getting them onto fishing boats bound for Sweden. Norway's mountain forests became hidden battlefields for resistance fighters, where cold and loneliness were their constant foes. 17-year-old Olav Jensen had joined the Norwegian guerrilla group Operation Milk, part of the Nordic branch of Britain's Special Operations Executive, SOE. Their core missions included not only sabotaging iron or transport lines but also gathering intelligence on German military deployments. The Narvik iron mines in northern Norway were Germany's primary source of iron ore during the war. Approximately 1 million tons of iron ore were transported by rail to the port of Trondheim each month, then shipped to Germany's Ruhr industrial region. One late night in June 1940, Olav and 5 comrades, armed with explosives and night vision goggles, sneaked into the Kirkens tunnel near the railway, an 800-meter-long tunnel that was a vital link in the iron ore transport route, guarded by German sentries at its entrance. Olav distracted the sentries by lighting branches outside the tunnel. While the German soldiers went to investigate, the other fighters rushed into the tunnel and planted time bombs under the railway tracks. At 3 a.m., when a German transport train, carrying 3,000 tons of iron ore, passed through the tunnel, the bombs exploded, breaking the tracks and derailing 3 carriages, halting transport for a full 3 days. After the operation, the Germans tightened railway patrols. Olav's comrade Eric was bitten on the left leg by a German guard dog while covering the team's retreat, and later developed a high fever from infection. With no antibiotics available, they had to rely on herbal remedies to reduce his fever. "We boiled pine needles in water to drink," Eric said. It tasted like prickly sunlight, Olav wrote in his post-war memoirs. It was this tenacity that allowed Norwegian guerrillas to destroy 1,200 kilometers of German-controlled railway and blow up 37 bridges between 1940 and 1945, causing severe logistical hiata. Resistance in the Netherlands manifested as passive resistance across all walks of life. After the port of Rotterdam was requisitioned by Germany, 20 shipyards began building landing craft for Operation Sea Lion, Germany's planned invasion of Britain. Workers ostensibly followed orders but found subtle ways to delay progress, deliberately installing engine parts incorrectly, reducing the landing craft's speed by 20%, skimping on waterproof glue at wooden joints, causing the vessels to leak easily after launching, even sneaking out small parts from the ships at night to disrupt construction the next day. 28-year-old Dutch paratrooper Jan van der Sar was working at a machinery factory in Rotterdam, tasked with assembling landing craft propellers. He would deliberately fasten the screws slightly loose, causing the propellers to make abnormal noises during operation and requiring frequent repairs. Once, a German officer discovered a propeller malfunction on a launched landing craft and tracking responsibility. Van der Sar stepped forward and admitted to operational error, earning himself 3 days in confinement. "There was only bread and water in the cell, but I had no regrets. At least that ship couldn't be used to attack Britain for the time being." Beyond factories, Dutch railway workers protested through strikes. In July 1940, railway workers in Rotterdam and Amsterdam went on a collective strike, delaying German ammunition transport by 5 days. Though the strike was eventually suppressed by the Germans, with 12 workers executed, more people chose to continue resisting by slowing down work. Underground resistance in Belgium centered on ideological struggle, with paper and ink as their most powerful weapons. In the basement of a church in Brussels' Old Town, 5 Belgian journalists, teachers, and printers used a vintage 1930 printing press to publish the underground newspaper Vrij België, Free Belgium, every week. Each 8-page issue included 3 sections: true updates on Allied military operations, to counter German propaganda claiming Allied collapse, data on German casualties, obtained from deserters from German hospitals, and satirical cartoons, such as depicting Hitler as a dictator in baby shoes. To evade German searches, they hid the newspapers in the linings of bread baskets, inside book covers, and even sewn into the linings of clothing, relying on couriers to distribute them to civilians. 35-year-old teacher Marie Lemur was one of the most active couriers. She carried a school bag filled with newspapers each day, pretending to head to work, while secretly passing them to students' parents, grocery store owners, and even the families of German soldiers. On one occasion, the wife of a German soldier secretly asked her for a copy, saying, "I want to know the real situation back home." The circulation of Frei Belgi grew from an initial 500 copies to 5,000, with 48 issues published throughout 1940, becoming a symbol of Belgian resistance. In 1941, the printing press was discovered by the Germans, and 2 printers were killed, but other members quickly rebuilt the printing operation in Antwerp, ensuring the newspaper was never discontinued. Across the English Channel in Britain, news of Western Europe's fall sparked brief panic but also ignited a nationwide resolve to fight on. On June 4, 1940, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his "We shall fight on the beaches" speech in the House of Commons. His voice, broadcast across Britain via the BBC, was even secretly recorded by underground resistance groups and played in occupied Western Europe. By this time, the 338,000 Allied soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk, including 215,000 British, 93,000 French, and 30,000 Belgian troops, were reorganizing in training camps in southern Britain. Though they had lost most of their equipment, their morale remained unbroken. The British Army quickly resupplied these soldiers. The United States provided 50 destroyers to Britain under the Destroyers for Bases agreement, while domestic factories ramped up production of Lee Enfield rifles, increasing monthly output from 10,000 to 30,000. 20-year-old British soldier Tom Wilson, who had lost his rifle during the Dunkirk evacuation, now held a newly issued rifle as he practiced shooting at a training ground in Dorset. A shrapnel scar still marked his left arm from the retreat. "We are not cowards, we retreated to fight another day." Tom later became a tank crewman in Britain's 7th Armoured Division. During the 1944 D-Day landings, the Sherman tank he operated was the first to break through German defenses, opening a gap for subsequent troops. The fall of Western Europe also quietly reshaped the strategic landscape of World War II. While Germany gained control of Western Europe's coastline and forward bases for an invasion of Britain, it was forced to divert troops for garrison duty, leaving only 13 divisions, far fewer than the planned 25, available for the launch of Operation Sea Lion, in September 1940. The Allies, meanwhile, learned painful lessons from the rout. Abandoning static defense, they accelerated the development of mechanized units and paratroopers. Britain formed its 1st Airborne Division in the second half of 1940, equipped with C-47 transport aircraft and gliders. The French government in exile established the Free France movement in London, recruiting over 30,000 soldiers who later became a key force in the D-Day landings. More importantly, the United States' stance on World War II began to shift. In June 1940, the U.S. Congress passed the National Defense Act, expanding the Army from 200,000 to 750,000 troops. In September, it sent the first batch of military aid to Britain, including 500,000 rifles, 80,000 machine guns, and 1,200 artillery pieces. Though this aid did not immediately turn the tide, it laid the groundwork for the Allies' subsequent counteroffensive. One early morning in December 1940, Olav Jensen received supplies airdropped by Britain's SOE in the mountains of northern Norway, including a radio transmitter, explosives, and an English textbook. Sitting in the snow, he stared at the word "London" on the transmitter, recalling the Allied soldiers he had seen in Trondheim 6 months earlier. Though they had retreated, their promised support had finally arrived. Meanwhile, in Copenhagen, Hans Christensen sewed the Danish flag into his newborn son's swaddle. In Rotterdam, van der Sar taught his son to sing the Dutch national anthem Wilhelmus. In Brussels, Marie Lemur tucked the latest issue of Frei Belgi into a Bible in the church. They did not know how long the war would last, nor if they would live to see victory, but they knew that as long as the spark of resistance remained unextinguished, freedom would eventually come. The April-May 1940 Blitzkrieg in Western Europe marked a critical turning point in World War II. It brought Germany to the peak of its military expansion, yet exposed the short-sightedness of its war-fueled war strategy. It subjected the Allies to a devastating rout, yet forced them to accelerate military reform and strategic coordination. It plunged 5 Western European countries into the shadow of occupation, yet nurtured an unyielding spirit of resistance. When Nazi flags flew over Western European cities, no one could have imagined that just 5 years later, those flags would be taken down, and those who had persisted in the darkness would witness the dawn of freedom. Hans would see Danish Jews return safely, Olav would watch the Norwegian royal family re-enter Oslo, Van der Sar would witness the Dutch flag rise again over the port of Rotterdam, Marie would see Free België become an important historical document in post-war Belgium. Beyond the pain, this war left an enduring story of courage and perseverance.